These are the minutes, again attended by you, of the Cabinet meeting held on Tuesday the 17th of March 2020. Page 5, paragraph 18, please. At subparagraph C, it says there, very active consideration was being given to the possible closure of schools and other educational establishments, but the evidence was not yet clear. The epidemiological evidence did not suggest that this measure would slow the transmission of COVID-19 down to a great extent and might in fact cause some additional infections, for example, by increasing children's exposure to grandparents over 70. And at page 9, paragraph 19D, it says the advantages, this is in the Cabinet agreement, the advantages and drawbacks of closing schools and other educational establishments should be considered further over coming days in light of emerging evidence across the UK. In your witness statement at paragraph 19 on page 9, you say, I felt the dialogue I had with Nicola Sturgeon about the closure of schools with effect from the 20th of March 2020 was a significant matter and was the product of informal communication. The circumstances were deteriorating quickly, school attendance was falling, staff anxieties were growing, and we needed to come to a definitive conclusion about whether schools should remain open. Nicola Sturgeon and I discussed the issue in person in the aftermath of the Cabinet of the 17th of March and again on the 18th of March. We took a decision that she should say on the 18th of March the likelihood was that schools would close on Friday the 20th of March, and I confirmed this closure would take place in a statement to Parliament on the 19th of March. In light of the evidence that we've seen, that on the 17th of March, the Cabinet minutes record that the epidemiological evidence did not suggest that this measure would slow the transmission of COVID-19 to a great extent, and it might in fact cause some additional issues. What epidemiological evidence were you and Nicola Sturgeon given on the 17th or 18th of March that underpinned the decision, which I understand you both took, to close schools?
In the evening of the 17th of March, I was provided with further advice from my education officials about wider dialogue they were engaged with the United Kingdom Government and the other devolved administrations about the issue of school closures and the possibility. And as part of that advice, they indicated to me that they thought it likely that Sage on the 18th of March would conclude that the epidemiological case was in place for the closure of schools and that that would in fact bring an advantage. The other, so that was the difference. So when I received some information from my officials, I think on the 9th of March, which indicated to me that Sage were not, largely replicating the point you made to Mr Dawson from the Cabinet minutes of that the evidence didn't exist. That was largely the advisory position from Sage in correspondence to me, I think, on the 9th of March. And then on the 17th of March, after the Cabinet meeting, I received this update which indicated that there was a growing assumption that Sage on the 18th would provide the epidemiological advice.
On what authority was the decision made?
On the 18th.
The decision to close schools, yes.
It was made as a consequence of direct discussion between the First Minister and I.
But not on the basis of a delegation of authority to make that decision if the situation changed from Cabinet?
That is fair, but my justification would be that events were moving at an absolutely ferocious pace, and I had to give clarity to the education system about what was likely to be pertaining in the days to come.
Was the advice from Sage based on Scottish information and data?
I don't know the answer to that question.
The position that we understand at this stage is that effectively English data was used in order to try to work out the threat of the pandemic at that stage, and that obviously, as we know, subsequently Scotland developed its own data systems and advisory systems to try to address that. Yeah. But at this stage, I think the position is that that would be based on English data.
I don't know that case, but obviously my officials were receiving advice from our clinical advisors, principally the Chief Medical Officer at that time, who took the view that was reflected in the advice that came to me, that there was that the appropriate step to take was to announce the closure of schools.
But you relied on the Sage advice, I think you said.
I did, that's correct, yes.
And did you have the opportunity to interrogate Sage about the application of that advice to Scotland?
I did not.
The position generally, epidemiologically, was that certainly London was considerably ahead of Scotland at that time in terms of the threat. Therefore, was it appropriate to base a decision on a conclusion reached by Sage without interrogating it further?
I think it was, because I think it was pretty clear that what was happening in London was coming our way, and it would be coming our way pretty shortly thereafter.
What equality impact assessment was done on the likely effects on children's learning and development of the schools being closed?
At that moment, we did not have the time or the opportunity to carry out that assessment.
Does that mean none? None?
None, that's correct, yes.
Mr Swinney, did you ever consider an alternative to a complete closure of schools? For example, certain year groups or mornings or afternoons, anything of that kind?
Not at that moment, my lady, because we felt that the severity of the situation that we were facing was of such a magnitude. Now, we did consider all of those questions at later stages for the return of pupils, which we envisaged potentially coming back on an approach which was called blended learning, which meant that some children would be in some days sometimes and not others, but eventually got to the point where we were able to return all pupils to full-time learning.
Thank you.
I was desperate to make sure that we could get schools back in the 11th of August for all the legitimate reasons that you put to me.
What I'm interested in is why that didn't happen earlier, Mr Swinney, because Professor Woolhouse, in his evidence on the 24th of January, told us it quickly became apparent through April and May 2020 that schools were contributing a little to the spread of the virus, but so little there was essentially no danger that reopening schools would take us past the tipping point. He said, so closing schools, I accept potentially as a precautionary element of the first lockdown, because let's face it, we were practically panicking at that stage. It was necessary or justifiable. But we should have realised much, much more quickly, based on the evidence emerging from around the world, that this was not an essential element of our lockdown. So in my view, and we're going to this, I argued it repeatedly and frequently over that whole summer. Schools in Scotland could have reopened in May 2020, just as they did in Denmark. Why was it that you didn't take account of that advice, Mr Swinney?
Well, some school pupils were back before the summer break, because we put a premium on young people who were making the transition from primary to secondary education, which is a challenging transition for many young people, was that they would be able to come back to experience some full-time, face-to-face learning in advance of the summer break. So we did actually, it's not just the case that pupils all came back on the 11th of August. We did take steps to get some pupils back before the summer break, recognising the beneficial element that that could be.
With respect, Mr Swinney, that's not an answer to my question. I asked you why it was you hadn't taken the epidemiological advice into account in considering sending all children.
Well, I didn't have that epidemiological advice from the advisory sources that were advising the Scottish Government. So I didn't have that from the group that was led by Professor Morris. I did not have that from the group led by Professor Tannehill. So I felt that I should follow and take account of the advice that I had in front of me that was offered to me from a wide range of disciplines.
Professor Woolhouse was a member of the group that was chaired by Professor Morris.
Well, I did not have advice in front of me which said I could safely bring back schools earlier.
Presumably, it must have been the position of the Professor Tannehill's group, if it existed at the time, that it would be a good idea from a harm-free perspective to get children back to school as early as possible.
Of course, yes, and that's the way they represented their advice to me. But it had to be done in a way that was compatible with the safety of everybody concerned, and also with the overall effort within the across the policy spectrum to suppress the prevalence of the virus.
Of course, so that harm-free consideration needed to be balanced against the harm-1 consideration, yes?
Yes.
But what
they
Professor
also,
Woolhouse is telling us is that from an epidemiological point of view, it would have been safe to do it earlier in the year.
well, but
To what extent, once the lockdown was announced, did you take account of medical evidence about whether and the extent to which school closures were assisting in the lockdown and their contribution to the overall spread of the virus in January 2020?
that would have been part of the assessment about the prevalence of the virus, and then led into the consideration of what was the right moment at which we could begin to restore full-time learning for children and young people. Yes,
so because again, Professor Woolhouse told us that although it might have been legitimate to be cautious about the extent to which the alpha variant, which had become the dominant variant at this stage, might behave differently from the previous variant with which we dealt in March. He said it very quickly became apparent in the second wave that schools did not need to remain closed and we could still control the virus, and yet they weren't fully reopened here until May 2021. This was unnecessary. Well, forgive me, this is one of the aspects of the pandemic management that I really feel strongly. What we did to the children, and it would be bad enough if there was a detectable and measurable public health benefit to this, but there wasn't. This wasn't necessary, and we did it anyway.